welcome to Afflictions Sugarcoated, a podcast where we sugarcoat some of the world's so-called afflictions and rate their plausibility on a scale of 1 to 5. I'm Minnie Kim, and today we'll be sugarcoating something called region locking. So let's start off with what exactly region locking is. But before that, I'll tell you why I'm making this episode. So a couple weeks back, we had a little debate competition, and one of the prepared motions for that competition was called "This House Would Ban Region Locking." And it's essentially this idea that, especially in Netflix, Sony, all of these companies, they restrict access to certain parts of their product based on the region. For example, this is why if you travel to another country, Netflix will not have the same shows. And it's a pretty weird motion. It's definitely more opposition biased, although we somehow managed to lose as opposition. Why not inform the world of what region locking actually is and what banning it would look like? So here it is. First, the proposition case as to why we should ban region locking. So, firstly, this debate is not really about whether people should have access to slightly better Netflix libraries, and that is the shallow version of the motion, and if proposition debates it that way, it'll obviously lose. At its core, this motion asks a much bigger question. In a world where digital goods can be distributed globally at almost no marginal cost, should private companies be allowed to exclude people from legal access purely because of where they live? Now, Proposition says no to this. We say that once a product is digital, once it is legal to be given in a country, and once the company is already capable of distributing it, geographic exclusion becomes an artificial barrier instead of a necessary one. And that artificial barrier has deep consequences for economic opportunity, access to knowledge, cultural participation, etc. Now, our side is not against compliance with local law. So, for example, if a government bans a platform or censors a film, proposition cannot and does not override that. So, an example of this would be China banning ChatGPT. Now, this motion is about something narrower and a lot more defensible. When a good is otherwise legal, companies should not be able to use IP addresses, account origins, billing regions, or hardware restrictions to decide that some people may access the digital world and others may not. In other words, the debate is about private control over legal access. It's not about public censorship. So the opposition will try to make this debate about business convenience, licensing complexity, etc. Now, those things matter, but they're not enough to justify a system that reproduces arbitrary inequality on a massive scale. So, our burden is to show that region locking creates structural harm serious enough to outweigh the efficiencies that it gives. We think that it does, and we prove that in three main ways. First, region locking entrenches global inequality by excluding entire populations from the tools and content that increasingly define participation in the modern economy. Second, region locking gives corporations illegitimate power to control access to culture, knowledge, and productive infrastructure. Third, region locking produces a broken and wasteful market by forcing people into piracy, circumvention, and illegality instead of legal participation. So, what will we actually ban under our side? Under our model, governments prohibit companies from using geography alone as a basis for restricting access to digital content, software, digital services, and digitally distributed tools where those goods are otherwise legal in the user's countries. So, moving on to the first substantive that we had on how region locking entrenches structural global inequality. And the thesis of this argument is simple. Region locking entrenches a two-tiered digital world in which people in wealthy countries receive broad access to the tools and content that drive opportunity, while people in poorer or less strategically important countries are systematically denied that same access. This is not unfair in a symbolic sense. It actively reproduces economic underdevelopment. Now, the first mechanism under this is that digital goods now function as economic infrastructure and not just entertainment. Software, AI tools, cloud services, editing platforms, developer APIs, educational resources, digital media ecosystems now operate as infrastructure. Now, they shape how people learn, how efficiently they work, what businesses they can build, how they access their jobs, etc. And this is especially true in a global economy. That means that access to digital goods is not comparable to access to a luxury handbag. If a student cannot access widely used productivity or AI tools, they're less prepared for global academic and professional environments. So if a startup cannot access the same APIs, then obviously the competitors in richer countries are just going to outcompete them. If creators in some markets can't legally access content ecosystems, they're more culturally isolated. This matters because opposition will try to minimize the harm, but our response is that digital economy has fused together media, information, productivity, education, work, all of those things. Now, the second mechanism here is that companies rationally prioritize high profit markets. So, region locking tracks and reproduces existing global power. So, it perpetuates a cycle. So, this means that countries like the United States, in Western Europe, or a handful of other high value regions will have access to some things, while smaller, poorer, and less commercially central countries are then delayed. Now, this just creates a self enforcing pattern. Two equally talented workers, students, or entrepreneurs can have radically different opportunities. And this is where proposition should be very forceful. We're not merely saying that inequality exists. We're saying that corporations use region locking to decide who gets to access the tools that through which inequality might otherwise be reduced. Mechanism three is that the harm falls on both individuals and local firms, so it depresses entire national ecosystems. Now, at the individual level, workers and students in region locked countries lose access to their tools, and that weakens their resumes. But at higher level firms, the harm is arguably worse. Innovation today is very layered, and most firms do not innovate by building every component from scratch. They innovate by combining existing platforms, models, software tools, and digital infrastructure into something new. Now, this is particularly harmful because they can't access these things. A startup in Nigeria, India, or the Philippines is more likely than a Silicon Valley giant to understand local logistics, healthcare gaps, etc. But if the basic digital tools they need are region locked or delayed, they can't effectively build those solutions. So the impact of this is just long term structural inequality, which I've probably already expanded a lot. The second substantive is that region locking gives corporations illegitimate power over culture. And this is essentially saying the thesis of it is saying that it gives private corporations the power to decide who gets to access legal culture, knowledge, etc. And the first mechanism here is that region locking lets firms go beyond the law and become private gatekeepers. And this is crucial. Governments are supposed to decide what is legal and illegal within their jurisdiction, but region locking allows companies to say, even though this product is still lawful in your country, you may not access it. So that creates a legitimacy problem. The second mechanism is that access to culture and information is socially constitutive and it's not trivial. Access to culture and information shapes very much what makes up someone's identity, and region locking fragments that access. Thirdly, region locking rebuilds borders inside the internet. Now, the internet's moral promise was never that every person would agree with every idea, but that geography would matter less for access to communication. And this matters because digital life is increasingly part of being a citizen. People apply for jobs online, build businesses online, basically do everything online. And that is a deeply corrosive principle to have something be region locked or these relevant spaces not be available to you. The impact of this is that region locking privatizes this access to culture, information, all of those things. So it only requires proving that the authority being exercised is too important and too unaccountable to be left entirely to private discretion. So that was the prop case. It's a very strong case simply on this one idea, and that was the greatest weakness of the prop case. The fact that there was one pretty strong idea, but opposition, as you will soon see, has a lot of strong ideas, not just one, but at least three very strong arguments. So here's what we said. Opposition's case is simple. Banning region locking does not remove discrimination, but it just allows for further inequity. In our side of the house, smaller firms and local products can grow in regional markets. In Proposition's world, only the biggest firms and broadest products survive. So, this debate is about whether you want impractical openness or real competition. First, on setup. I've one about what the proposition world looks like, and second on the world that we actually support. So, this is where we actually try to explain what region locking is. First, if you ban region locking, then in order for a company to put their product in the market, they cannot do it for one country. They have to do it for all countries. And this actually means that you will have to buy licensing rights for every single country in order for your product to be put on the market. So companies will only buy shows that they will be willing to buy licensing for every country. Now, these licenses are not only expensive, but you have to maintain these licenses. Licenses have to be renewed. So you have to continually pay fees if you want to maintain the showing of your product on the market. This also means that there is no difference in price between countries in their world. Currently, region locking allows for price differences. That means if someone in the US needs to pay $10 for a service, so does someone else in the Philippines or India for the same service. Now, what does Ops World look like then? We support a world with region lockings. Companies in our world are flexible and can choose to put their media, sell their electronics and software in certain nations, and the nations they choose can also change over time. However, we think that transparency requirements can be mandated on our side of the house too. So, that is to say, a company discloses why the region lock exists. Example is they justify price difference and access restrictions. If these reasons are not good enough or very exploitative, then of course they're going to get some public backlash and scrutiny. So the first substantive is why banning region locking entrenches big companies and kills innovation. So this does not create a fair market. It creates a market where only the biggest firms can survive, which means less competition and less innovation. So why is there less innovation? There are two layers here. First, on risk of experimentation. So this layer will inherently prove that all companies are going to be less innovative and experimenting with their aid. Firstly, when you ban region locking, you do not allow companies to test their products in one nation. That is to say, when region locking exists, companies are more likely to be experimentative. Companies can test a product out in one nation, then, if it is successful, open it up to more markets, and if it fails, remove the products. However, on side prop, without region locking, you can only release a product to the entire market. So companies are inherently less experimentative because the stakes are higher. Secondly, companies become less niche and more general. Companies on our side of the house through region locking tailor products to countries. They focus on specific nations' problems, specific population demographic problems, and release products based on that. However, through region locking, because you're buying licensing rights for every market, in order to make a profit, you have to be more generic and something that is widely used. So this means you avoid niche or specialized problems. So the impact of this layer then is that there's just less specialized and innovative products. Given that electronics and software also get region locked, you get less solutions to niche problems that actually matter and a less diversity of products on the market. So what do these solutions tangibly look like to give you some context? Firstly, we what in China, being very specific for Chinese economic ecosystems. Secondly, movies focus on country specific issues like themes of racism, religion, poverty specific to one culture or place. Three, Grab, the Uber equivalent in Southeast Asia, which is very tailored to Southeast Asian culture. Four, Sub Saharan Africa has inconsistent electricity, so phones and electronics are sometimes solar powered. So the second layer is on monopolies. This layer is going to prove that smaller nations get locked out of markets without region locking, causing monopolies, which leads to less innovation. So, why are small companies outcompeted by big ones? Licensing is a lot of money, and without region locking, you have to buy licensing fees for every country. Either smaller nations simply cannot afford this and get locked out of the markets, or they can, but they divert funds to the development of products. This means that they get outcompeted by larger companies. And the impact of this is that there's less competition within companies. That matters because competition is what forces companies to improve quality. They can release minor upgrades, copy each other, rely on market power rather than genuine innovation. And this is given and this is because given that they are the only company in the market, they know consumers automatically resort to them. Note that this disproportionately harms developing countries because companies in their nations are smaller and their population are impacted more by higher prices. So, the impact of the entire argument then is innovation. This means that real world problems get fixed only on our side, prices and get lower only on our side house as well. Our second argument is that banning region locking does not produce a richer or more inclusive global culture. The first reason is that if a company has to think in broader and less containable commercial terms, it'll prioritize products that can make money across the widest possible audience to make up for licensing fees in every nation. So, region locking gives local, on our side of the house though, region locking gives local ecosystems room to exist. They have regional streamers, local distributors, etc. That space matters because many local ecosystems are not weak because they lack quality, they're weak because they lack scale and capital. So once prop removes the ability to structure markets geographically, they become much easier for global platforms to overwhelm. Additionally, region locking gives certain incentives for large nations to innovate culturally because they only have to be licensing for countries they want to sell to. So the impacts of this is that there's less region specific things in culture on side prop. You get less films like Bollywood, Chinese dramas, etc. because they aren't mainstream to the entire world. Second, there's less identity specific things such as movies on queer identities, cultures that are often heavily consumed by people in Europe and some parts in Asia. This just means that society goes more towards westernization and erase important cultures and identities. And we ran a third on loss of regulatory sovereignty and legal control, which is essentially that governments lose the ability to enforce domestic laws. All in all, those were the two main arguments. I think it's a very valid point for both to make. Obviously, this is debate land, so if we had to choose something in real life, obviously we would choose side op. But a lot of the rhetoric did go to side prop, and I think that is in the end what gave them the win. The fact that there are a lot of impacts outside of just this idea of a greedy company losing innovation. There were people in developing nations that did not have access to goods that stunted their growth, that actively enforced a cycle of inequality. And of course, we can talk about the rhetoric all we want, but in reality, licensing costs are going to be extremely burdensome for these companies. So I saw side op as more of a reasonable side, a more realistic side. And apparently the judge did not buy it, unfortunately. He did value culture over economics, so the idea there in and of itself was a bit weird in the first place. But I guess this is to say that there's some random things you can learn by doing some random activities, and region locking is one of them. I remember of how we were thinking proposition was just not a feasible side. I mean, it was just impossible to win per proposition. But it turns out that's not entirely true. We can go on about what this says about random chance and random luck and how almost everything, is out of our control. But I choose to take this loss as a moment to learn more about region locking. And I've just read both of our speeches, at least our first speeches, out loud. and I've learned a lot more just by doing that. Take of that what you will. I still brew a lot of hatred for region locking for various other reasons, mainly the competition. But because I've still learned a lot, I give the sugarcoating of region locking, or our debate about region locking, a 3.5. This podcast was written and produced by me, Minnie Kim. If you have any comments or reviews, please feel free to write any and all thoughts in your podcast reviews. If you'd like to suggest an affliction for me to sugarcoat, please email me via afflictionsugarcoated@gmail.com. That wasn't a very deep topic, or maybe it was, but another one of our motions was how we prefer NGOs over international organizations like the UN. Now, that's something that you can think about for the rest of the day. Now, with that, I'll see you next month.